The man stood on the hill before the sun did, 4 in the morning, October 1872. The Montana sky above him was the absolute black of the hour before anything begins that honest darkness that makes no promises about what comes next. Ethan Aldrich stood at the crest of the
Keep
western
the line
ridge,
moving, hurry!
both hands loose at his sides, and looked down at the valley below. He did not stand there for the view. The view was the same as it had always been. The same pale outline of fence posts and barn rooftops. The same dark shapes of cattle standing motionless in the fields. The same long shadow of the main house, with its stone chimney and its heavy log walls, that his father had raised 20 years ago with 4 hired men, and more stubbornness than any of them had ever seen in a single human being. He stood on the hill because this was the one place on the ranch where nothing required him. Down there, things needed doing at every hour. The cattle needed tending. The accounts needed balancing. The men needed direction. The fences needed inspecting, and the horses needed working. And the machinery of a working ranch in the high country of Montana Territory needed constant human attention, or it began its slow and inevitable process of falling apart. Up here, nothing needed him. Up here, a man could simply exist without being useful. And for the 20 minutes Ethan Aldrich allowed himself on this ridge each morning before light, that was exactly what he did. He was 34 years old. He had the build of a man who had been working since he was old enough to hold a tool wide through the shoulders, heavy in the forearm, with hands that had learned the language of rope and timber and cold metal before they had fully finished growing. His hair was dark auburn, the color of October leaves before they go brown, and his eyes were amber, the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. He was not an unhappy man. He was careful to understand that about himself. He was not unhappy because unhappiness requires the expectation of something better. And Ethan Aldrich had stopped expecting things a long time ago. He ran the ranch well. He paid his men fairly. He kept his word. He worked harder than anyone who worked for him, and he had never asked a single person to do anything he had not done himself first. What he did not do and had not done in 3 years was allow himself to feel the warmth that comes from sitting at a table with other people and eating a meal they cook for you. What he did not do was sleep through an entire night without waking once, without lying in the dark and listening for something he knew would not answer. What he did not do was walk past the closed door at the end of the second-floor hallway without pausing for exactly one breath and then moving on before he could think too clearly about what was inside it. 3 years. 1,090 days, roughly, since the October night, when a lamp he had left burning in the grain storage barn had started a fire that had taken something from him that he could not replace or repair, or in any practical sense recover from. He did not think about that now. He was very good at not thinking about it. He had practiced not thinking about it for 1,090 days, and he had become quite skilled. The light in the kitchen window below flickered on a small, warm square of orange in the dark. That was Hank Morrison, who had worked for the Aldrich family for 20 years, and who was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 4:30 in the morning regardless of the season or the circumstances. Hank lighting the kitchen lamp was the signal as reliable as any clock that the day had officially decided to begin. Ethan watched the light for a moment. Then he turned and walked down the hill. Another day, the same as the 1,090 before it. He did not know that 16 miles away a stagecoach was rolling through the darkness with someone inside it who was about to make every single one of his assumptions about the future completely and permanently incorrect. She had read the contract so many times that the paper had softened at the folds. The way paper does when it has been handled by anxious hands over a long journey. The ink was still clear, though. The numbers were still precise, and the two signatures at the bottom, one in her mother's sharp and impatient hand, and one in a steady, masculine script that read, William Aldridge Mountain Ranch, Montana Territory, were still exactly what they had been when she had first looked at them in the sitting room of a house in Philadelphia that was no longer quite her home. Blythe Norris was 22 years old, and she had been traveling for 6 days. She sat on the hard wooden bench of the mail stage with her spine perfectly straight, the way her mother had always insisted upon. Though her mother was not here now, and would not be here when this stage finally stopped. She held the contract in both hands, not because she was reading it, not after 17 attempts at memorizing it, but because the physical weight of the paper was something real and definite in a situation that had very few definite things in it. The window of the stage was streaked with the red dust of Montana, a shade of rust that looked like dried blood in the lantern light and looked like autumn fire when the sun was right. The mountains outside were shapes in the dark, enormous and patient, and completely indifferent to the question of what would happen to Blythe Norris when this vehicle finally delivered her to a man who did not know she was coming. She was not a woman given to panic. Her father, a watchmaker on Chestnut Street, who had loved his work with the kind of devotion most men reserve for their families, had taught her before anything else. That panic was a waste of time that could otherwise be spent on problem solving. He had also left behind when his heart finally gave out on a gray Tuesday in March, a collection of debts that had surprised everyone who thought they knew him. Her mother, Eleanor Norris, was a practical woman in the way that some women become practical when they have been disappointed enough times to stop expecting grace from the world. She had looked at the debts. She had looked at her daughter. She had set the contract on the table between them and said, with the kind of gentleness that is really just tiredness wearing a different face, that this was the best available solution. Blythe had looked at the contract. She had looked at her mother. She had thought about the empty shelves in the larder, and the landlord who had begun stopping by more frequently than was comfortable. And she had understood that her mother was not wrong. She had picked up the pen. She was not angry about this. She had passed through something that might have been anger in the first days of the journey, somewhere between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, when the rocking of the stage had given her too much time and too few distractions. But anger required energy she needed for other things, and she had let it pass, the way she let most strong feelings pass by, acknowledging them briefly, and then setting them aside in favor of whatever the next practical problem happened to be. The next practical problem was this. She was going to a ranch in Montana Territory to meet a man she had never seen, and the arrangement had been made by a dead man. She had learned this at a way station in Wyoming from an older woman who was returning to her son's homestead after a visit to her sister. The woman had known William Aldridge apparently, or known of him, and she had told Blythe with the kindness of someone delivering an unpleasant truth to a person who will need time to prepare for it, that old William had passed in the spring. Blythe had asked very quietly whether the ranch had passed to his children. The woman had said yes, 3 sons, and then had returned to her knitting in the way of someone who has done the charitable thing and considers the matter settled. 3 sons, none of whom had written to confirm this arrangement, none of whom had been party to the original contract, none of whom she was nearly certain had the faintest idea that a young woman from Philadelphia was currently crossing the mountains in a mail stage with their family's address folded in her pocket. She looked out at the dust-streaked window at the shapes of the mountains in the dark. She could see their outlines now, blacker than the sky, enormous and very still. She put the contract away. She sat with her hands folded in her lap. She thought in the precise and methodical way her father had taught her about what she actually had to offer. She could cook. Not in the modest and self-deprecating way women were expected to say it, a way that meant they could produce acceptable meals without catastrophe. She meant she could actually cook in the way that mattered in practical terms, in the way that meant feeding people well from whatever ingredients were available, in the way that her grandmother had taught her in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried thyme, and her mother had drilled into her as a matter of discipline and economy, and she herself had refined through years of cooking for a father who was often too absorbed in his work to remember to eat until the smell of something good reached him in his workshop. A ranch in the high country of Montana Territory in October heading into winter would have 20 men or more to feed 3 times a day. She could do that. She knew she could do that. It was not everything, but it was somewhere to begin. The mountains grew larger in the window. The dust thinned as the road climbed. Somewhere ahead, at a place called Bitterroot Creek, the stage would stop and Blythe Norris would step out onto a platform and find out what happened next. She sat very straight with her hands folded and did not allow herself to imagine it going wrong. The Bitterroot Creek station was a low wooden building with a covered platform along one side and a hand-painted sign above the door that had weathered to the point where the letters were more memory than actual paint. The stage rolled in at 4 in the afternoon when the sun was low enough to turn everything amber, and the shadows were starting to stretch themselves across the ground in long, thin shapes. Blythe stepped down from the stage with her traveling bag in one hand and stood on the platform and looked around. There was no one there for her. The other passengers were met quickly, one by a man on horseback who nodded and turned without ceremony, one by a woman who embraced her, returned husband with the fierceness of someone who had been alone long enough, one by 2 boys who argued loudly about who would carry the packages. The stage driver unloaded the rest of the luggage with efficient disinterest. A dog came from somewhere and investigated the wheels. Blythe stood still and let the station empty around her. She had known on the basis of everything she now understood about the situation that there might not be anyone here. She had told herself this during the last stage of the journey had prepared for. It had constructed a reasonable plan. Find the station agent. Find a way to send word ahead. Find a means of getting to the ranch even without an escort. Knowing and experiencing, however, are 2 different operations. And for a moment, standing on that platform, with the dust settling and the last of the other passengers disappearing around corners, she felt the full weight of 6 days of travel and uncertainty, and the complete absence of any person in the world who was expecting her. She did not let it show. She adjusted her grip on her traveling bag and walked into the station office. The agent was a spare man of perhaps 60 with spectacles that had been repaired with a piece of wire at the left hinge. He looked up when she came in and his expression went through several adjustments in rapid succession, moving from neutral courtesy through something like recognition and settling on a careful neutrality that told her he knew something relevant. She laid the contract on his counter. She kept her voice even. "I'm looking for Aldridge Mountain Ranch. I have an arrangement with this address." The agent looked at the contract. He looked at the name at the bottom. He removed his spectacles, polished them with the hem of his shirt, replaced them, and looked again, as if hoping the name would have changed. "Miss," he said, and then stopped. "Yes. Old Mr. Aldridge passed in the spring. April, I believe it was." She had known this. She had been told this in Wyoming. And yet hearing it stated plainly in an office at the end of a 6-day journey with the mountains outside, and no one to meet her, and nowhere obvious to go, was a different experience from hearing it at a way station. She kept her face still. "I understand that. The ranch has passed to his sons. 3 of them, yes." He was watching her carefully now, the way people watch someone they think might be about to make a scene, prepared to be either sympathetic or defensive, depending on what came next. "The eldest is Ethan. He runs it now. But miss, he won't be expecting you. No one up there will be." "No," she agreed. "I understand that. The ranch is 16 miles up the western road, past Copper Pass. It's a long way to go to meet someone who doesn't know you're coming." She looked at him. She thought about 16 miles and no money for a hired horse and a leather bag that was growing heavier in her hand. "Is there anyone going that direction today? Any freight?" He considered. He went to the door, looked out, came back. "Ned Harker runs a supply wagon up to the high country on Thursdays. He generally passes through about now. I'll see if he's still at the feed store." "I would be grateful," she said. He found Ned Harker. Ned Harker was a man of perhaps 70, who had the dryness of someone who had spent 50 years in a country that took everything personally and gave nothing back voluntarily. He looked at Blythe the way a horse trader looks at an animal brought in for inspection, not unkind but thorough. And then he tilted his head toward the back of the wagon. "Room between the flour sacks," he said. "You'll be dusty." "I already am," she said, and climbed up. They were 3 miles up the mountain road before he spoke again. "You're the bride," he said. "Not a question." "There was an arrangement," she said. He chewed the inside of his cheek and watched his horses navigate a rut in the road. "Ethan doesn't know." "I gathered that." Another mile of silence. The road curved and the valley below appeared between 2 ridges, enormous and still. In the low afternoon light, the kind of landscape that makes a person feel small, in a way that is somehow not unpleasant. "He's not a man who takes surprises well," Ned said. "I don't imagine many people do. Some surprises more than others." He let that sit for a moment. "He had a woman 3 years back. Things went bad. Went very bad. Since then, he's been specific about what he lets into his life." She did not ask what had happened. It was not her information to seek, not yet, possibly not ever. "I understand." "I don't think you do yet," he said, with enough gentleness that it did not feel like cruelty. "But you'll have a better idea before long." That was the end of the conversation. She sat between the flour sacks and watched the mountains come closer. And she took the small cloth bundle from her bag, the one she had packed herself on the last morning in Philadelphia, a collection of dried herbs wrapped in brown linen thyme, and bay leaf and nutmeg and garlic, and a small piece of cinnamon bark that her grandmother had pressed into her hand at the door with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who communicates love entirely in practical gestures. She held the bundle in her lap and thought about what she was going to cook when she got there, if they let her. Not whether they would let her. What she was going to cook. The ranch appeared below the final curve of Copper Pass at the moment the sun touched the western peaks and turned everything it reached the color of heated iron. The valley floor was wide and green despite the season, with the blue line of a creek cutting through the middle distance, and the dark shapes of cattle spread across the grass in the unhurried arrangement that contented cattle make when they have enough room and enough to eat. The buildings stood at the north end of the valley, grouped in the way of ranches that have grown organically. Over decades, the main house anchoring everything with its 2 stories of log and stone, the big barn slightly to the northeast, the equipment sheds and grain storage, and the long, low bunkhouse arranged at working distances from each other. White rail fence ran south from the main house for 200 yards and disappeared over a gentle rise. Blythe looked at all of it from the wagon seat and understood in the way you understand something when you see its physical size for the first time, that this was a serious operation. This was not a small holding or a family homestead struggling on the edge of viability. This was a ranch that had been built with intention and maintained with discipline, and the man who ran it, whoever he turned out to be, was someone who knew what he was doing. She would remember that later. She would remember that she had been impressed before she was intimidated, which was perhaps the right order. Ned pulled his wagon up to the gate, and before she could climb down, she heard boots on hard ground, and a voice she would come to know well, warm and carrying, and aimed entirely in her direction. "Miss Norris, you're here." Walt Aldridge was 25 years old with light brown hair, bleached further at the temples by the summer sun, and a face that was the same strong-boned Aldridge structure as his brother's, but wore its expression with a kind of unguarded openness that was either very young or very rare. He had a smile that arrived at full strength with no preamble, the smile of someone who had not yet learned to moderate his enthusiasm for things that pleased him. He was clearly, completely, genuinely glad to see her. "I had word you were on the Thursday stage," he said, reaching up to take her bag before she asked. "I have your room ready. The second floor south facing you. Can see the whole lower pasture from the window." She was aware as she stepped down from the wagon that she was not alone in this moment of arrival. The awareness arrived as a change in the quality of the air, a stillness that had not been there a moment before. She turned. Ryder Aldridge was standing at the opening of the large barn, with his arms crossed and his weight settled back on one heel, the posture of a man who has arranged himself to observe rather than participate. He was 29, built like his older brother, but carrying it differently. The same broad frame and dark coloring, but where Ethan's stillness was a thing he had arrived at through damage, Ryder's was something he had constructed deliberately, a wall with specific purposes. He looked at Blythe the way you look at something that has appeared in a place where it has no obvious business being, not hostile exactly, but not warm either and entirely unconvinced. And then there was Ethan. He had come from around the far side of the large barn, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who belongs to a place so completely that the place moves around him rather than the other way around. He was holding a splitting axe, the head pointed at the ground, and he was wiping the blade with a strip of oiled leather. He was taller than both his brothers, broader with the presence of men who have spent their entire adult lives doing hard work in open country. The kind of presence that is not about aggression or display, but simply about the amount of space a body occupies when it has never learned to make itself smaller. He stopped. He looked at Blythe. She was aware that it was a thorough look, the kind that begins with the obvious facts. The traveling clothes and the single bag, and the posture of someone who has been sitting on hard surfaces for 6 days and moves quickly to less obvious assessments. She had the feeling of being read accurately and quickly, which was not unpleasant in itself, but was somewhat unnerving when attached to a face that gave very little back. Amber eyes. That was what she noticed first. Not warm amber, not cold amber, but the amber of something very old and very still a color that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most of what it saw. He turned those eyes to Walt. "You arranged this." Walt had the dignity not to look away. "Father arranged it. I followed through. Father is gone. His wishes aren't." There was a silence between them that had years in it, years of a dynamic between men who love each other and disagree about fundamental things, a silence in which a great deal was said without any of it being spoken. Then Ethan looked at Blythe again. His expression had not changed. It did not carry malice. It carried something perhaps worse from her perspective, which was complete reasonableness. He was a reasonable man arriving at a reasonable conclusion. "Send her back," he said. "I didn't make this arrangement. I won't hold to it. 3 words of instruction and 4 words of explanation." He said it the way a man says something he has already thought through and found correct. Blythe felt the words land. She felt them in her chest, the way you feel cold water, which is to say immediately and completely. And she felt the response that a person raised to be composed under pressure feels when composure is the only tool available. She looked at him. Not up at him, though she had to because he was more than half a foot taller, and she was tired and her feet hurt. And she was 1,700 miles from the last place she had understood as home. She looked at him directly, which is a different thing. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, and she was grateful that her voice came out even. "I understand that you didn't make this arrangement, and I understand this is your ranch. I'm not here to argue with either of those facts." He waited. "I've been 6 days on the stage. The money that would get me back east was used to pay my family's debts before I left. I have no means of returning, and I have no place to return to." Something moved across his face. Not sympathy, not exactly, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who understands the weight of situations that have no good exits. "What I do have," she said, "is the ability to cook for 20 men 3 times a day and make them glad about it. I'm asking for 1 week to show you that's true. If I can't demonstrate it in a week, I'll find my own way from here. I won't ask anything of you beyond what you'd give any hired hand." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, without warmth, but also without cruelty, "1 week. You'll feed the men in the house. If the food is good, we'll discuss what comes next. If it isn't, I'll see to your transport myself." He turned and walked back to his work. That was how it began. The house was larger than it appeared from the road. The ground floor held a main room with a stone fireplace, a long dining hall that could seat 30 if needed, a study with its door perpetually half closed in the kitchen. The kitchen was where Blythe went first before she unpacked, before she rested, before she did anything else. It was a good kitchen. She recognized good kitchens the way some people recognize good horses, not from any single feature, but from the accumulated evidence of competent use over time. The cast iron range was a Monarch 8-hole, heavy and black and well seasoned. The prep tables were solid hardwood scarred from years of work, but flat and stable. The shelves held provisions in reasonable order: flour and dried beans and cornmeal and salt pork and canned goods, in quantities that suggested someone did the ordering thoughtfully. One of the prep table legs was slightly short, and the table rocked when she put weight on the corner. She noted this and worked around it. She opened bins and jars. She tested the drawer on the firebox. She checked the water supply from the hand pump at the back sink. She calculated without pencil or paper what she could produce for breakfast in the morning and what she would need to start tonight. Hank Morrison found her there. He was 52 with a face that had been weathered to a quality of patient endurance, and he moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had spent years in it without ever claiming it as his own. He sat in the low chair near the back wall and watched her work without comment for a long moment. 22 men plus the 3 brothers, he said finally. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6. There's a man named Bobby Crane who eats more than his body has any right to hold, so account for that. He paused. The cook before you lasted 11 months and left because he said the winters were depressing. What about Mr. Ethan? Where does he eat? Hank's expression shifted enough to notice. I carry a tray to the study. He's eaten alone since. He did not finish the sentence. Since 3 years ago, she said. A pause. Walt told you. On the road. Hank considered this. He looked at her with the assessment of someone who makes judgments and reserves them. He eats because eating is necessary, he said carefully. He finishes what he's given because he was raised that way. But he doesn't taste it. Do you understand what I mean? She understood exactly what he meant. I'll need the root cellar stocked and the herb garden checked for what's still standing, she said. And I'll need to be up at 4 to start the bread. I'll unlock the cellar for you. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. He stood. He was almost at the door when she spoke again. The tray for the study. In the morning. I'll prepare it. He stopped. He turned back and looked at her with something close to careful appraisal. He doesn't like fuss. I know, she said. No fuss. He nodded once. It was the kind of nod that contains a whole conversation. Walt showed her to the second floor after supper. The room was small but clean, with a window that faced south over the lower pasture, exactly as he had promised, and a quilt on the bed that had the faded quality of something made a long time ago and kept carefully. She would have been glad to fall directly into it and sleep for 8 hours. She was not going to do that. But first, the hallway. It was when they passed the end of the corridor that she saw the door. It was different from the other doors in a way that was subtle and immediate. The others were plain working doors, wood-stained dark with age, and handling hung straight in their frames. This one was the same age and the same wood, and had been hung by the same carpenter. She could see that. But it had not been handled. The paint on the molding was faded from light exposure rather than from the friction of regular use, and there was at the top of the frame a brass lock that she had not seen on any other door in the house. The lock was engaged. Walt was ahead of her, moving toward the room he had prepared, and he noticed when she slowed. He stopped. He looked at the door. He looked at her. Something in his expression made a small and careful adjustment. "That room is closed," he said. "It's been closed for 3 years." She waited to see if more was coming. "Don't ask about it," he said. Not sharply. More in the way of someone warning a person away from a loose board. On a bridge, a practical caution more than a prohibition. Not to me. Not to Ryder. And especially not to Ethan. She looked at the door for one more moment. Then she looked away. "Good night, Walt," she said. "Good night, Miss Norris." She went to her room. She unpacked her single bag, hanging the spare dress and folding the rest. She set her grandmother's herb bundle on the windowsill where the morning light would reach it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the south-facing window at the pasture below, pale and still under a sky full of stars. She thought about the locked door. She noted it the way she noted everything in a new environment, with the attention of someone who understood that what a place keeps hidden is often the most important information it has to offer. But she did not pursue it because she had trained herself over years of living in a household where certain things were not to be examined, not to pursue questions that would not be answered. Tomorrow was more important than tonight's questions. She thought about biscuits. She thought about the hydration of dough in high-altitude air and what adjustments needed to be made. She thought about the firebox and how long it would take to reach working temperature from a cold start at 4 in the morning. She thought about the cast-iron skillets she had found on their hooks and whether they were seasoned well enough to run eggs without sticking. She fell asleep while she was thinking about biscuits. The kitchen was dark at 4 in the morning and cold in the way of high-altitude Montana in October. The kind of cold that has real weight to it and settles into wood and stone and does not leave until the fire changes its mind. Blythe lit the lamp and laid the fire in the firebox and stood back and watched the kindling catch. In the growing light of the flame, she looked at the kitchen with the assessment of someone starting work rather than ending a journey. This was the frame of mind she needed. Not Blythe Norris alone in a strange house at the edge of the wilderness. Blythe Norris in a kitchen with good equipment and decent provisions, and 22 men who needed feeding in 2 hours. She knew how to do this. She had known how to do this since she was 9 years old, standing on a wooden box in her grandmother's kitchen in Chester County, learning that bread dough had a feeling in your hands when it was right, and a different feeling when it wasn't, and that the difference mattered. She began. The biscuits first because they needed time. She worked the butter into the flour with her fingers, feeling for the texture her grandmother had taught her. A texture that had no better description than coarse sand after rain. And she added a small measure of ground cornmeal to the mix, a technique she had never seen anyone else use, but that her grandmother had insisted upon, which created a biscuit with a lighter crumb and a slightly crisper base that was different enough from what most people expected to be notable. She added dried thyme from her own bundle crumbled between her palms to release the oils. Not because it was particularly unusual to put thyme in biscuit dough, because this morning required something that was specifically cared about, and the thyme was the simplest way to say that. While the biscuits went into the oven, she started the salt pork, washing the cure off in cold water and slicing it thick, and then the eggs. A cast-iron skillet for 12 eggs at a time Butter browned just past, foaming before the eggs went in, which required constant attention, but produced a result that was categorically different from the same eggs cooked in a skillet that was merely hot. She added a small amount of the time a few grinds of pepper, nothing else. Coffee last because coffee brewed too long before serving became something that could reasonably be called an insult. At 5:45, she set the tray for the study. She took what she had prepared for the dining room and arranged it on the tray with the care she gave to everything and the addition of one thing she had found in the cold cellar the previous night. A small jar of apple preserve, dark and thick, which she set in a shallow dish beside the biscuits. Not elaborate, not fussy. Just the acknowledgement that a person eating alone in a study at 6 in the morning might want something sweet alongside something savory, and that no one had thought to offer it before. She handed the tray to Hank when he came in at 5:50. She said nothing about the apple preserve. He said nothing either. He went down the hall. At 6, the dining room filled. 22 men arrived for breakfast with the energy of people who expect their morning to be ordinary. They came in from the bunkhouse and the stables, stamping their boots clean, hanging their hats, settling onto the long benches with the comfortable ease of a ritual performed hundreds of times. Some of them looked at the kitchen doorway with mild curiosity. Some of them did not look at all. Bobby Crane looked. He was 21 with the good-natured appetite of a young man who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by how much he enjoyed food. And he looked at the kitchen doorway with something approaching hopefulness. Hank sat at his usual place at the end of the first bench and waited. The biscuits came out in a cloth-lined basket, still warm enough that the cloth was damp in places. Blythe set the eggs and the pork on the tables family style in heavy dishes, and she poured the coffee from the pot and stepped back. The first man to reach for a biscuit was a weathered hand of perhaps 50 named Callum, who had been on the Aldridge payroll for 8 years, and who was not a man given to visible emotion about food. He broke the biscuit open. Steam came out. He put half of it in his mouth. The conversation in the room, which had been the low, continuous hum of men exchanging the ordinary information of a working morning, stopped. It did not stop all at once. It stopped the way light goes when a lamp is turned down gradually. And from one end until the silence had reached the whole table, and everyone was doing the same thing, which was eating with more attention than they had expected to give it. Hank Morrison had been on the Aldridge Ranch for 20 years. He had eaten this breakfast, or something nominally resembling it, 365 days of every one of those years. He bit into a biscuit and chewed slowly, and then sat still for a moment, which was not something Hank did. He looked down at the biscuit. "Lord Almighty," he said under his breath to no one in particular. Bobby Crane ate his first biscuit in about 4 seconds and reached for a second before the first was entirely gone. He put down his fork mid-reach, which was something he had apparently never done before in the history of anyone who had ever known him. And he said with the pure, uncomplicated wonder of a young man who has just encountered something he did not know food could be, "What did you put in these?" "Thyme and cornmeal," she said from the kitchen doorway. "It's nothing special." "It's extremely special," Bobby Crane said, and went back to eating. The room did not return to conversation. It ate. It ate with the focused pleasure of people who are experiencing something they do not quite have words for, something that is about flavor, but also not entirely about flavor. Something that is about the way the food was made and what was in the making of it. Ryder Aldridge sat at the far end of the second bench and ate without looking up. He cleaned his plate. He went to the coffee pot and refilled his own cup, which was a small act of will that Blythe noticed because she noticed everything in a new environment. And then he sat back down and drank his coffee. He did not look at her, but he had refilled the coffee, which meant he wanted more, which meant something. She went back to the kitchen and began to clean. The tray came back from the study at 7:15. Hank carried it. She was at the sink working through the breakfast dishes, and she heard him set it on the side table behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She finished the bowl she was washing and set it on the drying board, and then she turned. The plate was clean. Everything on it, including the apple preserve, had been eaten. The coffee cup was empty. It was such a small thing. A clean plate and an empty cup. People finished their meals every day without it meaning anything. But Hank had told her the previous evening that this man ate because eating was necessary, that he finished what he was given out of the discipline of someone raised to waste nothing, that he did not taste. A man who is not tasting his food does not eat the apple preserve. He eats what is in front of him because it requires no decision. The preserve requires a decision. A small one reaching for something that was placed to one side outside the main arrangement. Something that was there because someone thought he might want it. He had reached for it. She turned back to the sink. She kept her face arranged in its usual composure. But something small and careful had shifted in her chest. Some calculation she had not known she was running had arrived at a preliminary result. 1 week, he had said, she thought about the root cellar inventory. She thought about what the bunkhouse fire meant for humidity in the bread. She thought about 7 breakfasts and 7 dinners and 7 suppers. She rinsed the last bowl and set it carefully in the drying rack. The afternoon of the first day settled into the ordinary rhythm of a working ranch in the late season. She spent it doing the work of a cook who intends to be there for more than a week, taking full inventory, assessing what would need to be supplemented before winter closed. The mountain road rebuilding the organization of the dry storage from a system she had not understood into a system she could use efficiently at 4 a.m. She did not see Ethan after breakfast. She heard him once giving directions to 2 of the hands about a section of fence that had gone soft near the creek. His voice carrying through the kitchen window with the unhurried precision of a man who has given directions so many times that he has eliminated every unnecessary word. Ryder she saw twice at a distance moving between the large barn and the equipment sheds with the focused energy of someone who keeps himself very busy on purpose. Both times he was aware of her before she was of him. Both times he did not change direction or acknowledge her presence, but he also did not look away immediately when she noticed him looking. It was the attention of someone who had already formed an opinion and was deciding what to do with a situation he had not been able to prevent. Walt came by the kitchen at 3 o'clock with an armload of wood for the stove box and stayed for half an hour, talking in the easy and informative way of someone who genuinely wanted her to understand and like the place she had arrived at. He told her about the creek and the winter feed situation and the age of the largest barn and the names of several horses that she should know about for reasons he made sound urgent. At 5 p.m, with the supper in progress and the kitchen warm with the smell of what was coming, Blythe looked through the window and watched Ryder Aldridge stop in the shadow of the smaller equipment shed, out of direct sight of the main house, but with a clear line of sight to the kitchen window, and she watched him stand still and look at the light coming out of it. She could not see his face at that distance, but she knew what a man looked like when he was watching something and deciding how much of a problem it was gonna be. She turned back to the stove. She kept her hands moving. Night came down over Aldridge Mountain Ranch completely. And without negotiation, the last of the light going from the peaks in the west, and then the whole valley filling with dark. The bunkhouse lamp went on. The kitchen lamp stayed on longer while the last of the dishes were washed, and the bread dough was mixed and set to prove, and the kitchen was left in the order that allowed a cook to begin efficiently at 4 in the morning, without having to make any decisions in the dark. In the study, a lamp burned as it burned every night. Blythe went up the stairs and past the closed door at the end of the hall without looking at it, without pausing, without breaking her step. In the study, Ethan Aldridge sat at his desk with a clean plate and an empty cup and a small smear of apple preserve on the side of the dish that he had not thought to notice he had eaten. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he opened the ranch ledger, and he did not permit himself to think about what that meant. Not yet. But he did not open the ledger for another 20 minutes. He sat with it closed in front of him, his thumb tracing the worn edge of the cover, the lamp burning low, the ranch quiet around him in the way it was always quiet at this hour. Late that night, after the house had gone entirely still, Hank Morrison woke to a sound from the kitchen below, a small and deliberate sound, the sound of someone working carefully in the dark. He went to the top of the stairs and looked down. The kitchen lamp was lit low, and in its light Ethan Aldridge was crouched under the prep table with a piece of fresh hardwood and a small hammer fitting a shim to the short leg, with the patient precision of a man who has identified a problem and intends to correct it. He was not rushing. He was not making a production of it. He was simply fixing a thing that needed fixing in the dark alone, at an hour when no one would see. Hank watched him for a moment. Then he went back to bed. He did not say anything about this to anyone the following day. He did not say anything about it ever. But in 20 years of watching this family, he had learned to recognize the language of Aldridge men when they were communicating something they did not have words for. And he understood what he had seen. The ranch changed in the days that followed. And the change was the kind that happened slowly enough that no single person could point to the moment it began. It began in small things. The men started arriving at the dining hall before the bell. Not by much, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. But enough that Hank noticed, because Hank noticed everything that deviated from pattern. And in 20 years he had never once needed to ring the bell twice. Now he did not need to ring it at all. Men who had spent years treating breakfast as a necessary interruption to sleep began appearing at the tables with something close to anticipation. They washed their hands without being told. They talked. During meals, real conversation. The kind where people are actually listening to each other, rather than waiting for their turn to speak, the kind that rises and falls with genuine laughter. They ate slower. This was the most remarkable thing. Men who had spent their lives eating the way they did everything else on a working ranch fast and without ceremony began to linger over their plates, not indulgently, but with the attention of people who have been reminded that food, when it is made with genuine care, deserves to be tasted. Blythe learned the layout of the kitchen completely. She learned the patterns of the men who arrived first and who arrived last, who took double portions without asking, and who left food on their plates from habit, rather than lack of appetite. She learned the quality of the silence that settled over the dining hall when the food was right, and she learned to read it the way a musician reads an audience. She slept 4 hours a night. This was not unusual for her. What was unusual was that she woke each morning not with the dull reluctance of someone facing a difficult situation, but with the clarity of a person who knows exactly what they are going to do and why it matters. On the 4th morning, she reached for the salt jar before anyone else was awake, and what came out of it was sweet. She stood in the lamplight with the jar open in her hand and tasted it again to be certain. Sugar. The jar labeled salt contained sugar, and the jar labeled sugar when she crossed to check it contained salt. Both lids were on. Both appeared undisturbed. The labels were her own, written the first evening when she reorganized the dry storage. She put the salt jar down. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she went to the back storeroom, found the sealed reserve sack of salt she had inventoried on the first night, brought it forward, and continued making breakfast. She said nothing to anyone, but from that morning forward, before she used anything from the kitchen shelves, she tasted it first. Every single ingredient, every single time without exception. It added perhaps 4 minutes to her morning preparation. She did not consider this an inconvenience. She considered it information. Someone in this house wanted her to fail in a way that looked like her own mistake. The 5th day brought a sound from the yard she had not heard before. A sharp, involuntary cry from a man who does not generally make noise, which meant it was the kind of pain that bypasses the will entirely. She came out of the kitchen door in time to see 6 men standing in a loose circle near the equipment shed, and Nate, a weathered hand of perhaps 40 who never said much but worked with the steady competence of someone who had done every job on a ranch at some point, sitting on a fence rail with his right hand held against his chest. His face was the color of someone managing pain they have not finished processing yet. A hammer lay on the ground, the angle of his index finger visible even from 10 feet away, communicated the situation without any further information being necessary. The men around him were doing what men in that situation generally do, which is stand close and look uncomfortable and offer no practical assistance. Blythe crossed the yard. She crouched in front of Nate and looked at his hand without touching it, yet making the assessment her father had taught her on the basis of his own considerable experience with workshop injuries. "Can you move it?" she asked. Nate looked at his hand. He tried. A small amount of movement accompanied by a significant amount of effort. "Good," she said. "That means the nerve is intact. I'm going to set it and splint it. It will be worse for about 3 seconds, and better immediately after." She looked at the men standing around him. 2 thin pieces of wood finger length, clean cloth enough to wrap twice. The men moved. They moved with the speed of people who are relieved to have a specific task. She set the finger the way her father had set her own when she was 11, and had broken it in a door with a firm and quick motion that was as economical as it was effective. Nate made a single sharp sound and then went quiet. She wrapped the splint, checked the tension, and told him he could work tomorrow with his left hand and light duty the day after that. Then she went back to the kitchen. She was at the stove before the men outside had finished talking about what they had just seen. Ethan was in the yard. He had been somewhere in that vicinity during what had just happened, because Hank told her later that the boss had stood at the corner of the equipment shed and watched the whole thing without stepping forward to assist. "He didn't need to step in," Hank said. "No," she agreed. She was washing the dinner dishes. He didn't. What she understood about that, and chose not to say out loud, was that a man who has watched someone he loved die, despite everything he could do, does not step in when the situation is already handled. He watches. He assesses. He makes the assessment of a man who has learned the hard way that there are situations where rushing forward makes things worse. Walt found her the next afternoon sitting outside the near cider barn in the last of the warm sun, shelling the dried beans she had brought up from the root cellar. He sat down on the fence rail nearby and was quiet for a while, which was unusual for Walt, who was almost never quiet when he had an audience. She waited. "You want to know about the room," he said. She kept shelling beans. "I've been here 5 days. I haven't asked." "But you want to know," he told her. He told her the way you tell a story you have been carrying for 3 years, slowly looking at the ground more than at the person you are telling it to, moving through the facts, with the care of someone who knows that facts are the only safe path through certain territories. 3 years ago, late October, the same season as now, Ethan had been engaged to be married to a young woman named Margaret Ellis, who had grown up in the adjacent valley and who had, by all accounts, been the kind of person who made a room feel easier to be in without doing anything particular to accomplish it. She had been 28 years old. She had been kind to the hands. She had called Ryder by a shortened version of his name that no one else used and gotten away with it. She had made old William Aldrich laugh at dinner more than anyone else had managed in the last years of his life, and she had been in the grain storage barn on the night Ethan forgot the lamp. He had gone out to check on a cow that was laboring with a difficult birth. He had left the oil lamp burning on the shelf inside the barn because he expected to be back in 10 minutes. He was gone for 45 because the birth was harder than expected. The fire started from the lamp. It moved fast the way fire moves through dry grain storage in October, with the absolute efficiency of something that has been given exactly what it needs. Margaret had come looking for him. She had gone into the barn to tell him about a letter that had arrived from his father's lawyer in Missoula, something she had wanted to give him while the mood was good. The old chalk bolt on the barn door had seized when the heat warped the frame. Ethan came back running when he saw the sky light up. He had torn the skin from both palms against the door. He had broken 2 fingers on his left hand trying to force the bolt. He had not gotten the door open. He had stood in the yard while the barn burned, and Margaret had called his name once, twice, 3 times. And then she had not called any more. Walt stopped talking. He looked at his hands, which were clasped in his lap. The mountains behind him were very still. Blythe sat with the shelled beans in her apron and did not say anything for a long time. "The door at the end of the hall," she said finally. It was her room. She used to stay here when the weather closed the pass. She had things there. Walt cleared his throat. He locked it the morning after. He's never opened it. And he's never been able to watch a fire since. Walt did not answer because the answer was obvious. She looked at the dried bean in her hand. She thought about what Hank had said on the first evening that Ethan ate because eating was necessary that he did not taste. She thought about the plate with the apple preserve eaten and the amber eyes that had assessed her in the yard without warmth, and the table in the kitchen that had been repaired with such precise and careful workmanship in the dark hours of that first night. She thought about what it costs a person to keep going after a thing like that. Not the dramatic cost, the visible grief, the acknowledged suffering, the daily cost. The 1,090 mornings of getting up and doing the work, because the work was what remained. She went back inside and made a lamb stew for dinner that she flavored with rosemary and a splash of cider vinegar. And she put it on the table in the heavy pot and let the smell do what the smell of certain foods always does, which is reach past the guards a person keeps and remind them briefly that they are still alive, and that being alive still has sensations worth having. Ethan's plate came back empty as it had every night since the first. On the 5th day, a new shelf appeared in the kitchen, mounted to the wall beside the range, at a height that she had not consciously noticed was exactly right for her, until she reached for it without thinking and her hand went to the right place, without having to look up or stretch. 8 inches lower than the existing shelves. Precisely the right distance from the floor for a woman who stood 5 feet and 3 inches in her boots. She said nothing about it. She noted it and she thought about it. And she thought about the table that had been perfectly level on the second morning. And she thought about what it means when a man who has closed himself against everything makes small improvements to the space that someone else is working in the dark alone, not telling anyone. He was not telling her she could stay, but he was making it easier to be there. On the 6th day, the kitchen window, which had required a two-handed technique involving a lifted push and a sideways twist to open, swung free on well-oiled hinges at the lightest touch. She stood at the window for a moment, her hand on the frame, the cold October air coming through clean and sharp. She looked out at the yard, at the mountains above, at the smoke rising straight from the bunkhouse chimney in the still morning air. Then she went back to work. The week ended on a Thursday, which was the 7th day since her arrival. Ethan had said one week had said it with the complete clarity of a man who had decided and was not negotiating. And the 7th day came and went without him saying anything at all. He walked through the yard. He gave directions. He worked. He ate his meals from the tray Hank carried to the study. He did not tell her to leave. He did not tell her to stay. Hank, passing through the kitchen on the 7th evening, set a clean tray on the side table and said in the tone of someone commenting on the weather, "He'll need the trail provisions packed by Friday. He's taking 3 hands up to the northeast pasture for 3 days. She asked how many men that left at the main ranch. He told her. She nodded and adjusted her provisions accordingly. Neither of them said anything about the week being over. Bobby Crane had been building toward a problem since the 2nd day in the increments. That a man of 21, who has been working in an all-male environment, does not recognize as anything other than the normal expression of a personality that has never been taught better. He had started with jokes which were not malicious, so much as thoughtless, the humor of someone testing boundaries without understanding that the boundaries were real. Blythe had absorbed these with the composure of someone who had been absorbing similar things her whole life. And she had continued to set his breakfast in front of him, and she had said nothing. On the 8th morning, he reached across when she set the coffee down and caught her wrist. It was not violent. It was not particularly forceful. It was the act of a young man who has been watching someone ignore his attention for several days and has decided that the attention requires a more direct expression. He did it in front of everyone, which was a kind of performance, and he said something that was designed to sound like a compliment and was in fact a small and deliberate reduction. Blythe looked down at his hand on her wrist. She looked up at him. She felt the full weight of 22 men in the room, the attention of a room that waits to see what happens next. She felt the careful balance of her position in this household, the awareness that anything she did here would be read as information about what she was. She was deciding. She was deciding very quickly. She did not have to decide all the way. From the far end of the second bench, Ryder Aldridge stood up. He did not stand up fast. He did not stand up with any drama. He simply rose from his seat with the unhurried weight of a man who has made a decision and is carrying it out. And he walked the length of the bench in the silence that his movement created. And he stopped directly behind Bobby Crane. "Bobby." He said it quietly enough that only the people nearby could hear it. And that quietness was precisely the thing that made it serious. Bobby looked up. He looked at Ryder's face. He let go of Blythe's wrist. "Outside," Ryder said. The room was completely silent. Bobby stood. He followed Ryder. The door closed behind them. Blythe poured the remaining coffee. She went back to the kitchen. She heard the conversation outside as a low and uninflected murmur through the wall. Ryder's voice doing most of the talking, Bobby's voice saying 2 or 3 things briefly, and then the quality of silence that follows when one person has said something definitive enough that there is nothing useful to add. She was at the sink when she heard the dining hall door open again. Not Ryder's step. Heavier. More deliberate. Ethan came through the dining hall door 2 minutes after Bobby Crane had left it. He had been at the equipment shed close enough to hear what had been said, and he stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the men still seated at the table. And then he looked toward the kitchen where Blythe had gone. He said nothing about what had just happened. He did not need to. He walked to the kitchen door and stood in the frame for a moment looking at her at the sink. And then he said evenly and without elaboration, "The work you do here is valued. I want that understood." He looked back once at the table. "By everyone in this house." Then he left. The dining hall was very quiet. Hank found her at the sink a few minutes after and stood beside her without speaking. "He came in," she said. "He did." She kept her hands in the water. She was not going to make more of it than it was. But she understood what it meant when a man who eats alone in a room and has done so for 3 years walks into the dining hall unprompted to say that someone's work matters. She cleared the dishes and kept her hands steady. When she came out to clear the table 20 minutes later, Bobby Crane's place at the bench was empty. She saw his bunkhouse bag through the window being carried toward the road. The next 2 days brought a new round of interference in the kitchen, more systematic than the first, as if whoever was behind it had reconsidered their methods. A cloth sack of dried herbs that she had stocked the previous week was soaked through with water that had not come from any leak. A jar of pepper with its top layer replaced by fine dust that was not pepper. She carried both into the yard and stood in the pale October light. Ryder was near the equipment shed working on a wagon axle. He saw her come out. He saw what she was holding. He straightened slowly the way a man straightens when he is not certain which direction the next thing will come from. She walked to him. She set the ruined herbs in the pepper jar on the fence post nearest to where he was standing. She looked at him. He looked at the jars. He looked at her. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. Miss Norris, I know it was you. I've known since the salt." He did not deny it. He looked at her with the amber eyes that were the same as Ethan's, but wore their color differently, with less of the haunted quality and more of a stubborn, worn-down honesty. "I know," he said. "I'd like to understand why." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, with the abruptness of someone who has decided that if they are going to say it, they might as well say it without preparation, "I watched my brother fall apart for 3 years over a woman. I wasn't going to watch it happen again." She waited. Margaret was good. Not in the way people say that as a compliment. Actually good. The kind of good that's just in a person the way grain is in wood. And when she was gone, Ethan went with her. Not all the way, but most of the way. And I have spent 3 years making sure nothing gets close enough to take the rest. The wind moved across the yard. From the barn, a horse shifted. "I understand why you did it," she said. He looked back at her. "I don't agree with how you did it, but I understand why." He absorbed this. Something in his jaw changed slightly, the way a muscle changes when it has been held tense for a long time and is given permission to ease. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here." He picked up the ruined herb sack and looked at it. "I'll replace this. I know where the supply is." "I'll replace it," he said again, with the stubbornness of a man doing penance in the only language he knows. She let him. That evening, 2 fresh cloth sacks of dried thyme appeared on the kitchen shelf, neat and dry and tied with a piece of kitchen twine. No note, no explanation, just the herbs. She folded them into the spice box and said nothing. Ryder found Ethan in the barn an hour before supper. Ethan was working on a broken rein, fitting the kind of precise small work that requires attention and good light, and produces a calm in a man who is otherwise not inclined toward calm. Ryder stood in the barn door. Ethan did not look up. "I tried to drive her off," Ryder said. It came out flat and direct, which was the only way Ryder said difficult things. Ethan continued working on the fitting. "I know. The salt, some other things. I know that too." A stretch of quiet between them. The horse in the far stall moved and settled. "She didn't go," Ryder said. "She didn't." Ryder leaned against the door frame. He looked at his boots. "She handled Nate's finger better than Doc Reardon would have. She handled the salt thing better than you deserved." The quiet came back. "Ethan." There was something in the way Ryder said his name that carried the weight of everything that came after, without saying any of it. "I'm not saying I was right. I'm saying I was afraid. There's a difference." Ethan set down the fitting. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his brother. And what passed between them in that look was the compressed communication of 2 men who grew up in the same house and lost the same thing and have never found the right words for any of it. "I know the difference," Ethan said. Ryder nodded. He pushed off the door frame and went back toward the bunkhouse. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Ethan picked up the rain fitting and went back to work. Outside the barn, somewhere behind the main house, smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. That quality of wood smoke that meant something was in progress, something deliberate and tended. The sky changed on the afternoon of the 11th day. It changed in the way that men who work in high country learn to read early. the way a clear blue afternoon becomes something else, not by a gradual transition, but by a sudden shift in the quality of the light, as if the whole sky has turned a corner. The color went from the clean pale blue of a dry October day to a dense and charged gray that had weight in it. The kind of gray that was not the soft gray of coming rain, but the gray of a system that has been building for days in the mountains to the west. Callum looked up from the fence he was repairing and turned to the man beside him without speaking. The man beside him had already stopped working. Hank came to the kitchen door. "Dry storm coming. Probably by tonight." She knew what that meant. Rain does not always accompany lightning in the high country in October. Sometimes the lightning arrives without the rain, and when it finds fuel, it finds it in the worst possible way. "I'll check the outbuildings after supper," she said. After the supper cleanup, she went out with a lantern and walked the perimeter of the buildings, pulling closed what was open and checking what looked loose. The grain storage barn was the one that worried her. Its eastern door faced the prevailing wind, and she had noticed since the first week that the latch mechanism had a tendency to work itself loose. She reached the door. She crossed to it and took hold of it. The latch was swollen from the recent rain and would not seat properly in its catch, no matter how she worked it. She tried twice. The door held well enough in still air, but in a hard wind it would swing open. She looked back at the main house. From inside, Hank called her name, something about the water barrel, something that needed 2 people and could not wait. She looked at the barn door one more time, at the latch that would not hold at the hay stacked beyond it, pale and dry in the lantern light. Then she went in. Behind her, the October wind picked up its pace. The lightning struck at 8 in the evening when the supper dishes were done and the dining hall had returned to its ordinary evening sounds. It struck to the west on the high ridge, and the light it made came through every window in the house, simultaneously turning the world white for a moment, and then returning it to ordinary. The thunder arrived 4 seconds later, a concussive roll that the mountains caught and amplified until it felt like something physical. In the silence after the thunder came a second light. It came from the grain storage barn. Orange and vivid, the orange of something organic burning that has been given enough oxygen to go fast. It showed in the east-facing window of the barn in a way that fire has shown in windows since the first time a human being understood what that light in that location meant. The door she had failed to latch had been pushed open by the wind, and the lamplight from the yard had been enough. The dining hall emptied in seconds. Men poured into the yard with the controlled urgency of people who know exactly how fast things go wrong when fire starts in a dry building in October. It was already in the rafters. The eastern wall of the grain storage, where the straw was bundled near the open door, had caught completely. The fire was in the roof beams on that side. Sparks were moving on the wind toward the equipment sheds 40 yards away. From the horse barn to the southeast, the horses were communicating their awareness of the situation in the direct and eloquent way horses communicate things they find unacceptable. The men moved, but they moved without direction, which is the danger of a crisis where the person with authority is not present. And giving orders in chaos has a velocity that is faster than individual good intention. She found Ethan first because Ethan was the person everyone was looking for and no one was finding. She found him at the north edge of the yard, 20 feet from the burning barn, and what she found stopped her for one step. He was standing still, not the stillness of a man assessing the situation, not the stillness of a man about to act. The complete and unreachable stillness of a man who is no longer in October of 1872 in the yard of his family's ranch, but in October of 3 years before that, in a yard that looked the same, and a situation that felt exactly identical, and carried the exact same quality of helplessness. The firelight was on his face. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were open and did not see the present. His lips moved. The wind was too loud for her to hear it from where she stood, but she could read it. The shape of a name. 2 syllables. Margaret. She understood then completely and entirely what she was looking at. She understood the locked door and the uneaten food, and the way he had stood at the corner of the equipment shed when Nate was hurt watching without stepping in. She understood the 3 years that Hank had described and Walt had described directly, and that the ranch itself had been describing in its silences since the first evening she arrived. She looked at him for one more breath, long enough to understand, not long enough to stop. She turned to the yard. "Listen to me." Her voice came out bigger and steadier than the voice of a person who is frightened, which she was entirely in the way of someone who knows exactly how bad this can get. All of you. Right now. The yard went still in the way that crowds go still when they hear something in a voice that tells them, this is not panic. This is direction. She pointed to the men nearest the well. Bucket line. Well to the east wall, no one stops, no one breaks. Now. She pointed to 3 men nearest the horse barn. Open the corral, drive them south. South away from the wind. Keep them moving. She looked at Ryder. He was standing 10 feet away and he was looking at his brother. And she could see in his face the expression of a man who is watching someone he loves be unreachable and does not know what to do with that. Ryder. She said it the way you say a word to someone who needs to be brought back into themselves. Ryder, get Ethan away from the barn, north side behind the fence. Now. He looked at her. 1 beat, 2 beats, and then he moved toward his brother. The bucket line formed. Men who had been standing in separate directions found their place in it with the efficiency of people who are given clear instruction at the right moment. And the first bucket moved from the well to the fire in under a minute. She ran to the kitchen house, found the heaviest pot, soaked a cloth in the water barrel, and came back out. She put herself at the front of the bucket line, the position nearest the fire, where the heat was significant, and the footing was uncertain from the water already on the ground. For 40 minutes she worked. She worked with the economy of someone who has accepted the situation and is spending no energy on the portion of it she cannot change. The barn was already lost on the east side. She knew that from the first minute. What she was saving was everything else: the roof of the south wall, the connection to the equipment shed, the hay stored in the lean-to that would feed the cattle through the winter. She made the decisions in real time, directing where the water went, calling men off positions that were no longer effective and shifting them to positions that were. Sparks landed on her sleeve on her collar once on the back of her right hand where the cloth had slipped. She did not stop. She adjusted and kept working. The fire peaked somewhere around 20 minutes in when the east wall's remaining uprights caught and the roof above them came down in a controlled collapse that sent a geyser of sparks 30 feet into the dark air. 3 men flinched back. She did not. "Hold the line," she said. "Don't let up." They did not let up. The 41st minute brought the moment when the quality of the smoke changed. Less orange in it, more gray. The fire that had been aggressive and expanding was now contained and burning down. The mountain wind that had pushed it east was doing something useful now, carrying the heat up and away instead of across. By the 50th minute, the east wall was a black framework of standing uprights, with nothing between them open to the sky. But the south wall stood. The roof of the south section stood. The lean-to was scorched on one side, but intact. The equipment sheds were untouched. The horses were in the south pasture, unsettled but unharmed. The men stopped working when there was nothing left to stop. They sat down on the ground where they were. Several of them put their hands on their knees and looked at the ground between their boots, with the expression of people who have spent a significant amount of themselves. The yard smelled of water and smoke and scorched wood, and the mineral smell of wet ash. Blythe stood where she had been standing. She looked at what remained of the east barn wall. She looked at what had been saved. She counted heads quickly twice, accounting for everyone in the yard. Her legs began to shake. Not much. Enough to notice. She put her hands on her knees and breathed. She found the locket when she was checking the south section of the barn, lantern in hand, making sure no embers remained in the straw near the intact storage. It was in the corner where the east wall met the south wall, in the angle of space that the fire had passed over, without reaching under a beam that had fallen, and created a small pocket of shadow. The lantern light caught the silver surface of it clearly, a small oval, tarnished by years and smoke, both with a chain still attached. She picked it up. It was warm from the surrounding heat, and heavier than she expected for its size, the weight of good metal rather than cheap alloy. She turned it over. On the back, an engraving that was still legible despite everything, a set of initials and a word. M-E-E. Always. She opened it. The portrait inside was small and protected by the closed halves of the locket. A young woman's face rendered in the careful detail of a photograph transferred to paper, preserved by the silver, that had kept the heat away. A face she did not know. Dark hair and light eyes and an expression that was not quite a smile. Something more than that. The expression of a person who is genuinely glad to be where they are and does not feel the need to perform gladness. She looked at this face for a moment. She looked at the initials. M-E-E. Margaret Ellis. And a middle name she did not know, made into those 3 letters that someone had chosen to put on a piece of silver, meant to be kept close. She closed the locket carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She finished checking the barn. She found no live embers. She came out into the yard. Ryder had gotten Ethan to the north fence and had kept him there through the worst of it. Standing close in the way that a man stands close when he knows his presence is the only thing he has to offer. By the time the fire went down, Ethan had come back to himself, not all the way, but enough to see the yard and the men and the standing barn wall. He was sitting against the fence post with his head forward when she came to him. Ryder was standing an arm's length away, looking at his brother with the careful attention of someone watching for signs. She sat down in the dust beside Ethan, not across from him, not hovering over him beside him. The way people sit when what is needed is presence and not performance. He raised his head. His face in the lantern light was stripped of every layer that he normally maintained, every careful management of what he showed the world. What was left was the face of a man who had lived through the same night twice and was not sure which time was which. "It's out," she said. "The east wall is gone. Everything else is standing." He breathed, once deliberately. "The horses are in the south pasture." No one was hurt. His hands were loose in his lap. She looked at them and saw what she knew was there, the faint lines of old scars on both palms, fully healed and white. The kind of scars that come from tearing skin against a surface that will not give. She reached into her apron pocket. She set the locket on the fence rail beside him without comment. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without moving. Then he reached out and picked it up. And she watched his face when he opened it. Watched the thing that happened when the face behind the silver oval became visible in the lantern light. She watched the way a human face absorbs something. It has been waiting 3 years to find the exhaustion and relief of a grief that has been held open, finally being given its final object. He closed the locket. He held it in his fist. When he looked at her, she looked back, and she did not look away, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the night had not already said. After a while he spoke. His voice was rough, but it was present, fully present, without the distance it sometimes carried. "Where did you find it?" "South corner, under a beam. The fire didn't reach there." He looked at the burned east wall. Then he looked at her hand where the burn from the ember had left a welt across the back of her wrist, red and definite against her pale skin. He said nothing, but he saw it, and she saw that he saw it, and they both understood that this was the only acknowledgement that was gonna happen, and it was sufficient. She got to her feet. Her legs were steadier now. "Get some sleep," she said, and she walked back toward the main house. Behind her, Ryder stood in the dark with his brother, and the sky above them was already beginning to clear the charged air of the dry storm moving east, leaving behind a cold that had the smell of the coming winter in it. The morning after the fire arrived the way mornings arrive after catastrophe, without ceremony, without regard for what the previous night had cost, the sun coming up over the eastern ridge at the same angle and the same unhurried pace as every other morning before it. Blythe was in the kitchen at 4 o'clock. She was there not because anyone required it or expected it, but because the alternative was to lie in her room with the smell of smoke still on her clothes and think about the things she had thought about too much in the dark hours between midnight and 3. She was better with her hands occupied. She had always been better with her hands occupied. Her right wrist was wrapped in a strip of clean cotton. The burn was not severe, the kind that stings reliably for several days and then fades without leaving much of a mark. But it was enough to register at the edges of her attention each time she moved that hand in a certain direction. She moved it anyway and noted the registration and continued. She made oatmeal. She made it the long way, starting with whole oats. She had coarsely ground herself the previous week, cooked slowly with water and a small amount of salt, finished with cream from the cold cellar, and a measure of brown sugar and the last of a small jar of dried cherries she had found in the back of the pantry 3 days ago and been saving. She did not know if this was the right occasion. She had decided it was close enough. Hank came in at 5:30 and looked at the wrapped wrist. He looked at the tray. "He'll be up," Hank said. He doesn't sleep after nights like that." I know. She had known without being told. She had learned enough about the pattern of a man who has trained himself to outrun bad hours by moving rather than waiting that she could predict his schedule better than she could predict the weather. Hank took the tray without being asked, which was itself a small thing that said something. The men arrived for breakfast and ate with the subdued attention of a group who have been through something together and are still processing the fact that it ended well when it easily could have ended otherwise. There was less talking than usual, and more eating, which was appropriate. She found Ethan in the second-floor hallway at 8 in the morning after breakfast, after the men had dispersed to their work, and the kitchen had been put right, and the day had settled into its ordinary rhythm. He was standing at the far end of the hall, standing at the locked door, not close to it, not with his hand on the latch, but at a distance of perhaps 6 feet. The way a person stands when they are considering something they are not yet ready to do. The locket was in his left hand. She could see the chain looped over 2 of his fingers, the silver disc resting against his palm. She stopped when she saw him. She had not intended to find him. There had come upstairs for a fresh cloth for the burn on her wrist, and had simply arrived at the wrong end of the hallway, at the wrong or perhaps the right moment. He heard her on the stairs. He did not turn immediately. He gave himself a moment which she understood as the moment of a man deciding whether to acknowledge what he was doing. And then he turned. His face in the morning light was different than she had seen it in any of the 11 days since she arrived. Not open, not soft, but different, like a surface that has been holding a long tension and has released some portion of it, not all, not most, but enough to be visible. She walked down the hallway toward him. She did not hurry. When she reached him, she held out her hand, and he set the locket in it without speaking. She looked at it in her palm, the small oval of tarnished silver, with its chain and its careful engraving. And then she turned it over and placed it back in his hand, with her fingers briefly over his. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was the gesture of someone returning something to its rightful place and confirming without language that it belongs there. "She made this room feel lighter," he said. It was not offered as a piece of information. It was the kind of thing a person says when they have been holding it alone for 3 years and have run out of reasons to keep holding it alone. "I imagine she did," Blythe said. He looked at the door. "I kept it closed because I thought opening it would make her less present. Less." He stopped. He had run into the barrier that stops certain men when they are trying to say something true. "I'm not certain," he said finally, that the logic held up. She looked at him. She said nothing because this was his territory, and she was not going to walk through it ahead of him. He put the locket in the breast pocket of his shirt where it would be close. He looked at the door one more time. Then he walked back down the hallway past her and went downstairs. She stood alone at the end of the hall with the closed door in front of her, and the smell of October coming through the narrow window at the end, and the quiet of a house that was slowly, very slowly adjusting. In the days that followed the fire, Ethan Aldrich changed in the way of a man who has been going in one direction for a long time and has not made a dramatic decision to go in another, but has simply stopped resisting the current that was already pulling him that way. On the second morning after the fire, he came into the kitchen at 7. After the man had eaten and cleared and sat in the low chair at the corner of the room while she worked. He did not offer a reason for being there. He did not pretend to have one. He brought coffee with him from the pot in the dining hall, which meant he had poured it himself, which meant the thing he had been doing every morning for 3 years, waiting for the tray to come to him, had stopped being sufficient. He sat in the corner for 20 minutes. He watched her work. He said 3 things. None of them particularly weighty, something about the inventory of winter feed. Now that the east section of the grain storage was compromised, something about the timeline for repair, a brief and almost comfortable comment about the quality of the oatmeal that morning that he appeared slightly surprised to find himself making. She answered each of these things directly and without ceremony, and did not make the mistake of treating them as more significant than they were, which was the trap that would have made him cautious. They were what they were: a man finding a reason to be in a room, a person finding a reason to let him. On the 3rd morning after the fire, he was there again. On the 4th morning, he brought a ledger with him, which gave him the structure of a purpose, and he worked on the account columns while she worked on the bread, and the kitchen was quiet. In the way it is quiet when 2 people are doing different things in the same space and are comfortable enough with each other that the silence does not require filling. On the 5th morning, he ate his breakfast at the kitchen table instead of in the study. Not at the dining hall table, not with the men, that was not where he was yet, but at the small kitchen table with the level surface with Hank and Blythe, and the ordinary sounds of a working morning around him. And he ate the oatmeal and drank the coffee and did not appear to find this particularly notable, which was itself the most notable thing about it. Walt walked past the kitchen door during that breakfast, saw his brother sitting at the kitchen table, and kept walking without changing expression for approximately 4 seconds, before the expression on his face became one that he had clearly not intended anyone to see. Hank, who had seen it, said nothing. His coffee cup hid most of his face at the relevant moment. The letter from Philadelphia arrived on a Wednesday. Walt was the one who sorted the mail that Wednesday, a task that rotated through the household without ceremony. He found the envelope near the bottom of the stack, a small rectangle of cream paper addressed in a woman's deliberate handwriting to Miss Blythe Norris. He looked at the return address for a long moment. Eleanor Norris, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He stood with it in his hand for a long moment with the expression of a man who has just understood something he did not want to understand. Then he carried the envelope upstairs and set it outside her door and went to find his brother. Ethan was in the study working on a letter to a supplier in Billings. He listened to what Walt said, which was brief and careful. Something about a letter from the East that had arrived for Miss Norris. Something about the return address. Ethan set down his pen. He looked at the desk for a moment. He said, "Thank you, Walt," with the complete evenness of a man who has decided something, but has not decided how to act on it yet. Walt left. Ethan sat at the desk for a while. He thought about the practical facts of the situation, which was the way he thought about all situations, because practical facts are both easier and more tractable than the other things. There was a young woman upstairs who had a letter from her mother. The letter, based on everything Walt had communicated without saying directly, was not a casual correspondence. There was a man in Baltimore whose name he had heard from Walt, a man named Gerald Hartley, with a mercantile business, and what Walt described as a long-standing arrangement with the Norris family, an arrangement that had most likely produced a sum of money that had reached Philadelphia with a set of expectations attached to it. He thought about 11 days. He thought about the kitchen table, and the window that opened, and the shelf that was the right height. He thought about a fire and a woman standing at the front of a bucket line when every man with more reason to be there was waiting for direction. He thought about apple preserve eaten on a plate that was supposed to be about necessity and not about want. He stood up. He went to the hook by the door and put on his coat. He walked out to the stable, saddled his horse in the dark of a morning that had not yet fully arrived, and rode the 16 miles down to Bitterroot Creek. The bank opened at 7. He was waiting on the steps when the clerk came to unlock the door. He composed and signed a wire transfer of funds to an address in Philadelphia, a sum exactly equivalent to whatever had been sent ahead to establish an arrangement. He did not know the exact figure. He estimated on the high side because he was not a man who liked to find out he had come up short on something that mattered. He rode back to the ranch. He was at the gate by 9:30. Smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney. He put his horse in the stable and walked to the main house. She was at the prep table when he came to the kitchen door, rolling pastry dough for the dinner pies. Flour on her hands and the focused quality of expression she had when she was doing something that required continuous attention. The kitchen smelled of butter and wood smoke and the beef stock that had been going since 6. She heard him come in and looked up. She saw the expression on his face, and she set down the rolling pin. She had read the letter twice the previous evening. She had folded it and put it in the drawer of her side table and lain awake for a while, not long looking at the ceiling and going through the practical facts of the situation. Her mother had arranged a marriage with a man named Gerald Hartley in Baltimore. Money had been sent ahead enough to resolve the remaining debts. She was required to return before the 1st of November, which was 10 days away. The Thursday morning stage from Bitterroot Creek would reach the Eastern Rail connection in 3 days. The practical facts were clear. The decision was not. She looked at Ethan Aldrich, standing in her kitchen doorway in a coat that was dusty from a long ride, with the expression of a man who has done something he is not sure he had the right to do, and is prepared to be told so. "You went to town this morning," she said. "Yes. Early. The bank opens at 7. She looked at him. He held her look with the full and uncomfortable directness of a man who has stopped managing his own face. "I sent money to Philadelphia, to the address on your mother's letter. Enough to cover whatever arrangement was made with whoever was made to." She was quiet for a moment. "You read my letter." "I read the return address. Walt told me enough." He did not apologize for this. He was not going to pretend that acting on incomplete information was not something he was responsible for. "I should have asked you first. I didn't because I was certain you would tell me it wasn't necessary, and I was not prepared to have that conversation without having already done something about it." She looked at the flour on her hands. She looked at the pastry she had been working on. She looked at him. "That money belongs to you," she said, "not to my mother's arrangement. The money is mine to use as I find useful. I found this useful. Mr. Aldrich." She said it with enough quiet weight that he heard the complete sentence she was not saying. "You cannot purchase someone's freedom and call it a gift." He was silent for a moment. This was a silence that had some respect in it. The silence of a man who has been told something accurate and is deciding how to respond accurately in return. "No," he said. "You're right. I can't." He looked at her steadily. "What I can do is remove the financial reason for you to have no choice." What you do after that is your decision. It should be your decision. I want it to be your decision." She was quiet. "I want to be clear about something," he said. He said it the way he said everything, carefully and without excess, but she could hear the effort of it now. The cost of saying what was true instead of what was safe. "I am not a man who does this easily. If I were the kind of man who did this easily, I would have said something before I rode to Bitterroot Creek. Or I would have asked you directly what you wanted, or I would have managed to have this conversation at a time when you don't have flour on your hands and something on the stove." She looked at him. "What I am is a man who has eaten alone in a room for 3 years because it was simpler than the alternative, and I am aware that that is not a recommendation." Something in the way he said this, a quality of self-knowledge that is neither self-pity nor apology, but simply a clear description of a fact, reached her in a way that she had not expected to be reached. "What I know," he continued, "is that since you have been in this kitchen, I have eaten every meal. I have slept without counting hours. And I have found reasons to be in this room that I am not going to pretend were about the firebox or the ledger." She set the rolling pin down with a sound that was very small in the quiet kitchen. "I'm not asking you to stay because of a contract. The contract was my father's and it's done. I'm not asking you to stay because you have no other place to go. You have a place to go now if you want it." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay because it is what I want, and I have not wanted anything in 3 years. That seems like relevant information." The morning light through the kitchen window was the clear, cold light of late October. The kind of light that shows everything without being kind about it. The dust on the high shelves and the scorch mark on the edge of the prep table from a moment 3 mornings ago, when she had not moved fast enough, and the flour on her hands, and the man standing in the doorway who had ridden 16 miles before sunrise to remove an obstacle from her path without asking her permission first, which was the most thoroughly Ethan Aldrich thing that had ever happened. "You could have told me this before you went to the bank," she said. "I could have. And then you would have told me you could handle your own affairs, which you can, and nothing would have been decided." She was quiet for a moment longer, the quiet of someone who is being honest with themselves about what they want to be true, before they allow themselves to say it. "If I stay," she said, "what does that look like?" He considered this with the same care he gave to everything that mattered. "I don't know exactly. I know that the winter is coming and the ranch will need everything both of us have to give it. I know that I would like to eat breakfast at that table every morning." He paused. "And I know that I want more time. Time to learn what comes after 3 years of not letting anything come close." She looked at him. He looked back. "Then I'll stay," she said. It was not the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of a different one. A longer one, the kind that takes not weeks but seasons and years. And the accumulated experience of 2 people learning the language of each other. The language of which silences mean what, and which kind of help is welcome, and which kind is not. And how to stand close enough to someone that you become part of their ordinary days without either of you disappearing into the other. But it was a beginning. He nodded. He put his hat back on the hook by the door. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened the ledger he had left there the previous morning. And she turned back to the pastry. and the kitchen continued to be what it had been since the first morning she lit the range, a place where something real was being tended. The porch on the western side of the house caught the last light of the afternoon in a way that Blythe had not fully appreciated until the evening after Ethan came back from Bitterroot Creek, when the light was so clear and golden that it seemed to exist for its own sake rather than as a transition to the dark. She found him there after supper, sitting on the edge of the porch with his back against the post and his long legs extended in front of him, looking at the valley below, where the creek caught the last of the light and turned it silver. She sat down on the step beside him, not at the far end of the porch, beside him close enough that the space between them was the space of proximity rather than the space of distance. For a while, they did not say anything. This had become one of the things she understood about him, that silence with him was not the uncomfortable silence of two people who have run out of things to say, but the comfortable silence of two people who have decided that being in the same place at the same time is sufficient unto itself. The valley went dark from the east end. First, the shadows pooling in the low places before the higher ground gave up its light, and the mountains in the west held their color longest the way they always did. The peaks going from gold to rose to the gray-blue. That was the last thing before dark. The east section of the barn, he said. We can have it rebuilt before the hard freeze if we start next week. The grain loss was about 30%, she said. What's in the root cellar will carry through February. We'll need to supplement from the Bitterroot supply before March. He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the valley. You calculated that, he said. Last week, after I finished the inventory. He was quiet for a moment, without being asked. I thought it was useful information. He continued to look at her, and she felt the weight of it, not uncomfortable but full. The look of someone who is paying a different kind of attention than they have been paying and is noticing the difference. She turned and looked at him, and the light was almost entirely gone now. Just the faintest blue remaining over the highest peaks. And in that light his face was different from any version of it she had seen in daylight. The amber of his eyes almost dark. The lines of his face at rest in a way they were not, when the day was demanding things from him. His hand moved the deliberate movement of a man making a considered choice, and set itself over her hand where it rested on the porch step. His palm was rough from years of work and warm from the day's heat, and he did not move it again, did not do anything with it except leave it there. She turned her hand, and their fingers found each other, and they sat like that in the last of the October light, while the valley finished going dark, and the first stars appeared over the eastern ridge, 1 and then 3, and then more until the sky above the mountains was dense with them. There was nothing extraordinary about it. Two people on a porch in the dark, holding hands in the manner of people who have both lost enough to understand the value of what they currently have. But ordinary things, when they are the right ordinary things at the right time, contain the whole of what a life is made of. The creek below caught the starlight in long moving lines. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying. The dark and the stars and the cold, clean air of a high Montana evening said all of it. And they were both for the first time in some version of years simply present in a moment without any part of themselves being elsewhere. Ryder was up before the sun the following morning. This was not unusual. What was unusual was where he went. He went upstairs. He had the key in his coat pocket. He had carried it there for 3 years in the way that people carry things they do not know what to do with, not discarding them because to discard them would require a decision, not using them because using them would require a different kind of decision. The key was small and brass and had a weight that he knew entirely by feel. The hallway was dark and cold. At 4:30 in the morning, the house still around him in the way of a house that is genuinely asleep and not merely quiet. He walked the length of the hall without hurrying and stopped in front of the door at the far end. He stood there for a moment. He thought about Margaret Ellis, who had called him by a shortened version of his name that no one else used, and had done so with the complete authority of someone who had simply decided this was correct. He thought about what Walt had said to him last spring, which was that holding on to things does not preserve what they were. It only prevents you from becoming what comes next. He thought about the morning 2 days ago when he had stood outside the kitchen window and heard faintly the sound of his brother's voice in conversation. Actual conversation. The relaxed and unguarded kind that Ethan had not participated in since October 3 years ago. And the sound of a woman's voice answering and the way those two sounds together had made something in his chest that he had been bracing against for years quietly and completely release. He put the key in the lock. He turned it. He pushed the door open. The room was dim and cold and full of the stillness of a place that has not been disturbed in a long time. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of things that have been held in suspension, waiting. The window faced east, and in the first gray light before sunrise, the outlines of the furniture were visible. The narrow bed and the small table and the chair. The few personal things left on the surfaces: a hairbrush, a folded square of cloth, a small bottle of something that had long since dried. He did not go inside. He stood in the doorway and he looked at these things for a long time. Then he took a breath, a long and deliberate breath, the kind that marks an intention, the way a signature marks a document. He stepped back. He left the door open. He did not close it behind him. He left it open to the hallway, open to the cold October air coming through the house, open to whatever morning would bring. When the sun finally came over the ridge and the light came in through the east-facing window and touched everything in that room for the first time in 3 years, he walked back down the hall. He went downstairs. He put the key on the table by the front door where it could be found by whoever needed it, and he went out to start the morning's work. At 6 o'clock, the kitchen lamp came on, visible from the yard, that small warm square of orange in the dark that had been the signal of every morning since Hank Morrison first lit it 20 years ago, the signal that the house was awake and the day was beginning. At 6:15, Ethan Aldridge came down the stairs. He came down without a ledger, without a pretense. He came down in the way of someone going to a place they have decided belongs in the pattern of their days, unhurriedly and without explanation, because no explanation was required. The kitchen was warm. The range was going, the firebox stoked and steady. The temperature already at the working level that took an hour to achieve, and that Blythe had learned to maintain through the morning without either over or under feeding the fire. She was at the table. Bread dough set to the side, biscuits in the oven, the morning's work in its ordinary progress. She heard him on the stairs, and then she heard the kitchen door. And she did not turn around. She reached to the shelf to her left, the shelf at the right height, and took down the second cup. without looking, and poured it without measuring the amount a man pours when he has had the same cup every morning long enough to know it by feel. She set it on the table at the corner nearest the low chair. He sat down. He picked up the cup. He drank. From the yard, the sounds of the ranch beginning its day came through the window that now opened easily. The sound of Hank's voice and the response of someone too distant to identify the sound of a gate and horses and the ordinary machinery of a working morning. She shaped the last of the biscuits and put them in the pan and slid the pan into the oven and set the timer in her head, the way she had set timers in her head since she was 9 years old, in her grandmother's kitchen, learning that bread does not lie, that bread gives you exactly what you put into it, and no more, and no less. Behind her, Ethan Aldridge sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and the morning went on around them, and neither of them felt the need to remark on the fact that this was where they both were, because some things do not require remarking. Some things simply are, and the being of them is sufficient, and the understanding of them exists in the space between two people who have learned through different and difficult paths to trust what is real. The biscuits rose in the oven. The coffee cooled to a drinkable temperature. The October light came through the kitchen window in the long, slanted way of mornings in the high country, illuminating the flour dust on the prep table and the burn mark on her wrist that was already fading, and the ledger Ethan had left from the previous morning still open to the column he had been working on. Walt came through the kitchen at 6:30 to retrieve a coil of rope he had left by the back door, and stopped when he saw his brother sitting at the table. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Blythe. He looked at the 2 cups. He picked up his rope. He left without saying anything. What was on his face as he went out the back door was the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has now seen it happen and finds that it is exactly what they hoped, and nothing has been exaggerated. Ryder was at the equipment shed when Walt came across the yard. Walt stopped beside him. He did not say anything for a moment, just stood looking at the barn, at the smoke from the kitchen chimney, at the clear, cold morning sky above the ranch. Then he said, "He's sitting in the kitchen." Ryder did not look up from the hinge he was repairing. "I know," he said. Walt looked at him. "I could hear them from the yard," Ryder said. He went back to the hinge. His hands were steady and his voice was steady, and the quality of his stillness this morning was entirely different from the quality it had been 3 weeks ago. Less like a wall and more like bedrock, something that holds not by resisting, but by simply being there. The horses in the south pasture moved through the morning grass. The creek ran. The sky above the mountains was the pale blue of a dry October morning in the high country, cloudless and very clean. The ranch went about its work. Some things do not end. They continue in altered form, carrying forward what was essential and releasing what was not, the way a river carries forward in a new channel. After a flood has changed the landscape, still the same river, still moving toward the same destination, but no longer the same path. Ethan Aldridge had lost something 3 years before that he was not going to recover. He understood this clearly, the way a man understands the permanent nature of certain facts when he has had enough time to stop arguing with them. What he had lost was not going to be returned. The room at the end of the hall was a room again, now open to the air, and the woman whose things were in it was still gone. and would always be gone. And the grief of that would always be a true thing. But grief and living are not opposites. That was what he had believed for 3 years, that to continue living fully was a form of forgetting, a kind of betrayal enacted daily. He understood now with the clarity of a man who has been shown the error of his understanding by someone who had no idea they were doing it, that this was wrong, that the person who had loved him would not have wanted 3 years of this, that the best way to honor what had been was not to stop, but to continue, and to continue well. He did not say this to anyone. He did not need to. These were not things that required saying. They were things that required doing, and he had been doing them for 11 days in the incremental and unglamorous way that real changes happen by showing up and sitting down and drinking the coffee and letting what was true be true. In the kitchen each morning, Blythe Norris worked. She worked with the quiet competence of someone who has found the right place for what they know. How to do, the satisfaction of a skill being used in full, rather than in fragments. She thought about the winter provisions and the spring menu and the things she had not tried yet with the equipment she now knew completely. And she thought about the people she was feeding and what they needed from her on any given morning. And she did this the way her grandmother had taught her, with her full attention, and without holding anything back. This was the life she had crossed 1,700 miles and 6 days of hard roads to find. Not the life she had agreed to in a signed contract in a parlor in Philadelphia. The life she had arrived at through the accumulation of days of doing exactly what she was capable of doing, and being exactly who she was. Outside, the winter was coming. In the high country of Montana Territory in October, it came with the same certainty and the same indifference to preference that every important thing arrives with on its own schedule, without asking permission. But the fire was tended. The smoke went up. The bread was in the oven. Some things are enough. Some things are more than enough. Some things are simply what a life is when you have found the right place to live it. The mountains stood in their permanent way above the valley. The creek ran below. The kitchen lamp burned.